Yeah, so this distinction between radical awakening and evolutionary awakening has become a major passion for me over the last 15 years or so. There's something that feels very significant in it for me. Awakening, if we just start there, we could say like awakening broadly is where there's some significant shift in the way that we experience ourselves in the world that changes things, that then provides a different vantage point for how we see ourselves, how we understand who am I, what am I, and how we understand the world and how we participate in our relationships, how we show up in the world. So it's been the claim of spiritual traditions through time that they offer transformational pathways and practices that facilitate stages of awakening in people, and that people can go through transformational processes that radically rewire the way that they experience self, other, and world.
Welcome to the Maxarch podcast, where we awaken together and share our greatest gifts with the world. And my guest today is Jon Eden Khan. Jon is the co-author of Earth is Eden. And this is probably the book that I recommend most to my spiritual friends. Jon is also initiator of a global political party, and he's also a leader and facilitator for Awakening. I really appreciate you coming to my podcast, Jon.
My pleasure to be with you, Max. Happy to dive in and have some, I'm sure, fascinating conversations.
So today we're talking about radical and evolutionary awakening, the Trans-Himalayan teachings, and the purpose of the earth. So maybe we can start by getting an overview. What are the Trans-Himalayan teachings, Jon?
Sure thing. So the Trans-Himalayan teachings are a body of teachings that started to emerge around the 1880s with the work of Helena Blavatsky. So I love to talk about Helena Blavatsky just because she was a tidal wave of a woman. And there's so much that could be said about her. But basically, she was someone who, she was arranged to be married when she was 18, and she decided that wasn't the life that she wanted to have. She was called to the Himalayas. She felt a deep inner call to go to the Himalayas. She was Russian, and she tried to penetrate the Himalayas 3 times before she made it. And she then said that she was being called inwardly by contact with a community of liberated beings who she said that she then spent 3 years being trained by and essentially set up for her mission. And she then left this mountain refuge, as it were, and started the Theosophical Society and the Theosophical Movement, which really was one of a number of movements that's happened through history that's essentially dedicated to the emergence of a global spirituality that integrates the contributions of different traditions simultaneously with major dimensions of culture, science, philosophy, and so on. So the theosophical stuff is really the first phase of the Trans-Himalayan teachings. And then later came a woman called Alice Bailey, who received a huge body of, it's like telepathically received teachings from a Tibetan master who called himself Drol Kul. And there was also another woman, Helena Roerich, who received a whole body of teachings, another woman, Lucille Cederkrantz, who received a whole body of teachings, Rudolf Steiner, who a lot of people are quite familiar with, was absolutely part of this movement broadly. He was originally a theosophist and then later started his own movement, anthroposophy. And then more recently, one of my teachers, Bruce Lyon, has also received a whole body of teachings, which we understand are a continuation of this tradition of teaching. So it's been going for about 150 years, and it's essentially a body of spiritual teachings which seek to s- integrate and synthesize spiritual teachings from East and West, and simultaneously they add a huge, they add a lot more, right? And they add a lot more because the claim of the tradition and the claim of the teachings is that the source of the teachings is actually a group of liberated beings who are inhabiting stages of development which most human beings are not aware even exist. So, you know, even those of us who are familiar with awakening or enlightenment teachings, there's a kind of mysterious question that often remains. Well, okay, well, what happens then? What happens once, if, let's say, we have a being, or let's say there have been beings, as multiple awakening traditions tell us, who have established and stabilized full awakening, full enlightenment, what then? And this body of teachings, the Trans-Himalayan teachings, would suggest that, okay, well, yes, that's a profoundly significant stage of the evolutionary process, as it were, and the path leads on, and that there are continued stages of development that happen for beings who, by this stage, have realized the relative emptiness of their own being and who are abiding in and as absolute reality, and yet still, for the relative expressions of those beings, there's a path that continues going. And so, and every spiritual tradition actually has some understanding that there is a group of liberated beings on the planet who tend to guide evolution and awakening from behind the scenes, whether that is the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas within the Buddhist tradition, whether it's the Hindu tradition has this idea of Siddha Ashrama, that there's an ashram of siddhas that lives in the Himalayas somewhere, and that there are liberated beings who are forces of support for the evolutionary process of humanity. There's the hidden righteous ones in Kabbalah. There's the immortals of the Taoists, and in the Bible, there's a reference to the community of just men made perfect. Um, yeah, there's this is an ancient, continuous teaching that liberated beings exist. That actually there is a community or communities of them on the planet. I think in the Sufi tradition, there's some teaching that says that there's always some particular number. I forget the exact number now of those beings on the planet. So I guess where I'm going here is, because the Trans-Himalayan teachings claim to be from a source of beings who are inhabiting stages of development that essentially give them access to a much bigger view across time and space, then there's a whole body of teachings which this tradition contains, which go beyond that which at least has been discovered to exist openly within the spiritual traditions of the planet. Personally, I imagine that perhaps there are um, teachings which exist which are not given openly within certain spiritual traditions. Maybe in the Buddhist tradition, maybe in the Indian tradition, maybe in certain shamanic traditions, there are teachings which they do not share openly, which could feel like they're pointing to a similar thing, or orienting in the same direction as some of the Trans-Himalayan stuff, but it's not given openly. So yeah, there's a much vaster time space perspective that the Trans-Himalayan teachings offer, which to me make them profound and exciting as offerings to the emergence of a genuinely cosmocentric spirituality. And I don't know about you, but for me, I know there's a lot of cosmic stuff out there, but for me, it doesn't quite satisfy my need for deep, soulful, intellectual rigor that simultaneously is um, yeah, has a grounding and an orientation in the truth and the depth of what awakening really represents, and then simultaneously is grounded and engaged with what's really happening on the planet in a way that's sober and at the same time plugged into the sacred. So yeah, yeah, the Trans-Himalayan teachings for me, they are, for the most part, I would say they're really the most sophisticated body of what I would describe and what we'll go on to explore as the most sophisticated body of evolutionary awakening teachings that I've ever come into contact with. And by that, what I mean is that they are about what is the multidimensional, cosmically significant evolutionary process that's happening on the planet that is relevant to the path of every soul, but also relevant to humanity as a whole, also relevant to the earth as a whole, also relevant to where we find our place within the wider cosmic context. And then what has been a real inspiration for me is that in the most recent, the most recent teachings that have been emerging through Bruce's work, through Bruce Lyon's work, as it's started to get into this exploration and integration of the radical awakening teachings as well. And yeah, for me, that starts to orient us to at least two really critical pieces of what could be a genuinely global spirituality that integrates the contributions of different traditions, into something coherent and that is dedicated deeply to human potential, to what it really means to be a human being. That's what I'm passionate about, the relevance of these teachings to the full vision and blossoming of what it means to be a human being at this kind of critical and extraordinary time in history.
Before we dive deeper into a lot of things you just mentioned, as well as radical and evolutionary awakening, I
Yeah.
feel it's important to also get an overview of integral theory, because also in your book, Earth is Eden, you looked at the Trans-Himalayan teachings from this integral perspective. So please share an overview of your understanding of integral theory.
Yeah, sure thing. So I think there's kind of three bodies of teachings that I've been most in love with in my life. And one has been the Trans-Himalayan teachings. One has been the Tibetan Buddhist and particularly Dzogchen teachings. And the other has been integral theory that, yeah, has emerged from Ken Wilber. And I think Ken Wilber's work is really part of the same stream as I would say the Trans-Himalayan teachings are broadly. I don't know whether Wilber would be happy about someone saying that, but for me, from my perspective, is there've been particular beings at significant points in time who have made really, really valuable contributions to really the question of how do we put it all together? That's really the question that exists at the heart of the Trans-Himalayan teachings, also in the heart of integral theory from Wilber. But, Blavatsky, who I mentioned previously, she made a great contribution there. People like Aurobindo did that with the Indian tradition, also with combining that with the evolutionary context that was coming out of the Western world at that time. As I say, I feel like Wilber's work is part of that stream. Other people like Andrew Cohen as well. Like there've been various who have made significant contributions here. Thomas Hubel now as well, I think. So Wilber, Ken Wilber, and integral theory is one really very powerful, psychoactive, important contribution to that project. And so Wilber developed integral theory, and integral theory is basically a meta theory. So it's a theory of theories. It's a theory that can integrate and combine and make sense of. The claim of it is all the different, domains and areas of understanding and cultivated knowledge of humanity. So it's a framework for how it all fits together. In detail, you could say that there's 5 different parts of the integral theory. There's the quadrants, there's the levels, there's the lines, there's the types, there's the states. But these are all ways that if you look through the lens of this theory, what Wilber says is you realize, oh, in certain ways, everyone's right. Actually, everyone's right in a certain way, and that the normal fault lines of conflict between disciplines, theorists, areas of knowledge can be smoothed out through to left behind, because we realize that actually these different contributions, whether it's understanding how psychological stages of development correlate with brain states, and also correlate with stages of collective anthropological development, through to different ways that our societies have structured and organized themselves over time. These are completely different and often unrelated disciplines and disciplines of human knowledge. And as I understand it, within the academic world now, and probably for the last 15 years or so, multidisciplinary theories that can not just advance one particular area of understanding, whether it's psychology or mathematics or philosophy or biology or social science or whatever, but that can see how these things fit together into an integrated whole that tells us more about the human being and tells us more about culture and tells us more about the world, are a major focus. So integral theory is something that has occasionally landed a bit in the academic world, and there's areas where it is super helpful, and I think there's areas where it doesn't quite satisfy certain the needs of the academic world for certain very detailed levels of evidence and proof. But to me, integral theory has been a hugely useful frame that absolutely contributes to how I see the world, and I think it really helps us make sense of how the different areas of human experience, spiritual development, psychology, culture, societal, and even cosmocentric kind of evolution fit together.
Mm-hmm. Beautifully summarized. So you mentioned already before radical and evolutionary awakening, which are very important concepts in Earth's Eden. So what is the difference between evolutionary and radical awakening, and what is awakening at all?
Sure thing. Yeah, so this distinction between radical awakening and evolutionary awakening has become a major passion for me. Over the last 15 years or so, there's something that feels very significant in it for me. Awakening, if we just start there, we could say like awakening broadly is where there's some significant shift in the way that we experience ourselves in the world that changes things. That then provides a different vantage point for how we see ourselves, how we understand who am I, what am I, and how we understand the world and how we participate in our relationships, how we show up in the world. So it's been the claim of spiritual traditions through time that they offer transformational pathways and practices that facilitate stages of awakening in people, and that people can go through transformational processes that radically rewire the way that they experience self, other, and world. So then if we get into a bit more detail with the distinction of radical awakening and evolutionary awakening, radical awakening, I would say, is really at the core of the traditions of the East. And so, then we talk about Buddhism, we talk about the schools within Buddhism, such as Zen, or even Theravada as well, the Tibetan schools, Dzogchen, Mahamudra, also Tibetan Tantra, and so on. Those traditions, we'd also talk about the Indian traditions, Vedanta, Shaivite Tantra, Yeah, these are examples of traditions that their focus is awakening to the absolute reality that transcends and is arising as the entire universe, right? And their invitation is to recognize that that reality is the true nature of the consciousness which is ever present in our experience. So, yeah, that is the I am that kind of transmission of Vedanta, and it's also the pointing out that happens in traditions like Dzogchen and Mahamudra, pointing out this ever present awareness, which is the awareness that I'm seeing you in now, that I'm present with you in now, without me needing to go anywhere else into any exotic or transcendental state. Just this awareness, its true nature is an absolute reality that transcends and is embracing as the entire universe. So that's really the gift of the Eastern traditions. Obviously, that's a huge generalization because the East is filled with a vast diversity of traditions that focus on all sorts of different things. Um, and for me, and in terms of what I feel like I'm in service to, I do feel like there is a particular keynote of that's really at the heart of the Indian tradition, whether we call that Hinduism or, and I get the Hinduism as a phrase that doesn't isn't fully satisfying to everyone, but the traditions within that of Vedanta, Shaivite Tantra, and certain other traditions there, and Buddhism, they're about waking up. They're about waking up to and as the one absolute reality. So that's radical awakening. Evolutionary awakening is about pathways that facilitate stages of awakening to different levels of our experience within the multidimensional evolutionary cosmos. So that could be Western psychology that focuses on how to have a healthy relationship between body and mind and emotions. It could be uh, spirituality that focuses on soul work, which is about starting to wake up to the sense that, okay, actually, I think that I am I'm actually a being on a journey deeper than this surface level personality of mind, emotion, and body. I'm a being on a journey that is remembering who I really am and bringing online my sense of purpose and the light that wants to come through me, and the service that I'm here to bring. Um, the Trans-Himalayan teachings, for instance, provide what has been one of the most sophisticated maps of the levels of the evolutionary awakening path that I've ever come into contact with. But I think you could really see the teachings at the heart of the Abrahamic traditions, for instance, which often are about how to in their esoteric dimensions. I mean, not necessarily in their exoteric dimensions. This is another important distinction. Every spiritual tradition has an exoteric dimension and an esoteric dimension. The exoteric, exo, outer, the outer part often relates to how to live a moral life, how to how to live a life that tradition sanctions as good, is in harmony with the community, and gives you a worldview. Like, here's a worldview to inhabit. Here's how to live a good life. But the esoteric dimension of a tradition is really about the more mystical, transformational practices and experiences that a tradition can support a being to move through in the awakening process. So I'd say, just going back to the point I was making, with the Abrahamic traditions, with their more mystical aspects and their esoteric aspects, they're really about how to live as an awakening soul who is a vehicle for the will of God, expressing as love and as service in the world. I think it's fair that that could be described as an essence piece at the heart of the Abrahamic traditions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. And then you could also say, the shamanic traditions as well are often to do with, they're focusing on um, the levels of the physical plane and its energetic substrate, and how to rightly relate to those levels, and the kind of the lower psychic levels, how to relate to yeah, the fields of energy and consciousness and psyche that exist there, and how to essentially live in harmony there, how to live in harmony with ourselves, how to live in harmony with each other, and how to live in harmony with the earth. Now, none of those things that I've just described in terms of evolutionary awakening is about awakening to an absolute reality that transcends and embraces the entire cosmos. None of them are about that. They're about awakening to different levels of who we are and showing up, establishing the best health in and between those levels, and bringing them online to show up in the best way we can in the world. That's really what they're about, right? So sometimes I feel like people, it's a common thing that people say, well, all spiritual paths are just leading to the same place. And I don't think it's true. It's not true. Like, they're not actually. If you study them a bit more deeply, they're not all leading to the same place. But that doesn't mean it's just all random and different. There is a pattern, and the pattern, in my view, at a high level view, would be, first of all, to make this distinction between radical awakening and evolutionary awakening, and then there's even further levels of granularity we can get into. But yeah, very general level, the gift of the East, radical awakening, and the gift of the West, although that's a very general kind of way to put it, or at least the traditions which have come to flourish in the West, more to do with evolutionary awakening. And just to add a couple of layers onto that, you know, even just the Western tradition broadly, more in an academic sense, when we're speaking about science, and whether it's philosophy and biology and, and physics and so on, evolution is at the core, fundamentally, really, of the Western academic tradition. And I think it's really fascinating to start to tune in to there actually being a shared essence to the spiritual, psychological, and academic dimensions of the Western tradition, or the traditions which have flourished in the West, because whether they're dealing with psychological development, whether they're dealing with spiritual development, or whether they're dealing with collective cultural or physical, physical or biological development, often they are circling this piece around evolution.
Mm-hmm.
And whereas in the East, their traditions have been less interested in that. They've really been more interested in what is the source and ultimate ground of reality itself. So I hope that has kind of made some of the parameters of this clear.
Yeah. So where do you see the embodiment in the world? Is that part of the evolutionary awakening?
Yeah,
Like the way you show up in the world and you work with your shadow?
yeah, yeah. I mean, the radical awakening traditions have that too. They care about how you show up and how you demonstrate your awakening. And I think there's a relevance of embodiment to both. And it depends what we mean, really, actually, I guess, about embodiment. If we're talking about embodiment as how does one demonstrate and live one's awakening to and as absolute reality, then that's more in the radical awakening domain. If we're talking, I live in Berlin, for instance, so there's a lot of embodiment spirituality here, but it's absolutely it's in the evolutionary awakening domain. None of it's really to do with how do you demonstrate absolute reality through your body. It's much more to do with how does my consciousness have a really grounded, integrated expression through my physical body, and how does that, support me to show up in the world and in relation to myself and my relationships in a more healthy way. That's much more on the evolutionary awakening side. Do you see what I mean?
Mm-hmm. So I want to ask uh, a personal question that would lead to the more general question about it. The personal question is, so I'm in awakened awareness, in the radical awakening. Why am I not clearly communicating on the evolutionary plane with my soul? And the general question behind this is, how do these two vectors of awakening relate to each other? And why can one be awakened in radical awakening but have maybe not the full access to the soul plane or even the monadic plane?
Yeah. Okay, so we're diving in now, Max, because these are some of the most, profound and detailed questions. I feel that the book that you mentioned before that Dustin and I wrote, Earth is Eden, goes really into detail around these questions, which we completely geeked out on for a long time. And I'm tremendously grateful for the opportunity that we had to really dive into these questions. So first of all, I just add another layer on what I've shared already by saying that something that I'm passionate about is that if we can make this distinction between radical awakening and evolutionary awakening, and I get that it's a high level generalization. There's really important levels of granularity and detail that are underneath it, which maybe have some tension with it. I'm fully open to that. But if we make the distinction, first of all, at the very least, that there is an important difference between radical awakening and evolutionary awakening, then we can start to honor different traditions and practices as they are without, uh, without incorrectly comparing them or judging them by the same standards in ways which is inappropriate because they're actually trying to do different things. So if we and then to start to move into your question, once we have that distinction alive in our awareness, it starts to illuminate interesting dynamics, challenges, and questions which have existed within these traditions, have also existed within the dialogues of teachers and the dialogues of communities, which start to point to the questions that you're asking. So, um, for instance, if we understand that radical awakening, that's a real thing, that there are pathways whereby beings can engage contemplative, sometimes energetic practices that allow them to recognize the true nature of their awareness as the ultimate reality arising as all things. And we then also acknowledge that there are beings who demonstrate that and have been demonstrating that for a long time. Do they automatically have access to all the stuff that the evolutionary awakening pathways are talking about? It seems not. It seems not, for instance, because actually, for instance, Buddhism is a good example here. Buddhism doesn't really care about who you are as a soul. you know? Like it doesn't really care about that. It's not interested to try and have you wake up as who you are as a soul, work out what your particular gifts and contributions are, have you go through whatever needed integration processes need to happen as a soul with your incarnated self or even your trans-incarnatory self, or past lives or future lives. There are masters who participate in that, who start to have that kind of thing that they're working with, but it doesn't focus on any of that. It focuses purely on how to have a basically integrated self, to be coming from your heart, to have established a sense that you're not any different from anybody else, and then wake up. So if we look at if we just go to the evolutionary awakening side for a minute, and you made reference to this in your question, and just begin with mapping out that basically every evolutionary awakening tradition has suggested that a human being has at least three levels, right? In the Christian tradition or in the Abrahamic traditions, there's often, there's a body, there's a soul, there's a spirit. Yeah. So if we expand body to our embodied self, our personality structure, I would say our mental, emotional, and physical personality structure, that's my vehicle for doing my thing in the world. And then that's one level of the evolutionary self. Then let's say there's a soul, there's a transpersonal spiritual being that's moving between lifetimes, which the Eastern radical awakening traditions are all completely fine with, even though they struggle sometimes to go into the detail of explaining how it all works. And then there's the spirit aspect, which is, generally the evolutionary awakening teachings all describe the spirit is the breath of God, is an expression of the life force of divinity. So if we just start there and then go back to the evolutionary awakening side, often what the radical, if we go back to the radical awakening side, often what the radical awakening traditions are doing is trying to give you a healthy personality structure and then wake up. And so they don't necessarily focus on getting you into soul. They certainly don't talk about monadic stuff, and and by that I mean spirit. And what I'd say is I think there are ways that radical awakening lubricates the path for evolutionary awakening, but it does not automatically produce it. And for why I say that is it's there are many examples of beings who seem to have had relatively stable to stable radical awakening who are openly critical of, or certainly it doesn't seem to be part of their experience, that they're waking up and integrating who they are as a transpersonal soul. If you look at the most advanced dimensions, like probably the Tibetan tradition, the tradition of Tibetan Buddhism is a good example of a tradition that teaches about, and we have enough cross-cultural dialogue and study and exploration to have a decent look at what they're holding. And what that seems to reveal is that in the most advanced levels of awakening, as they describe it, there do seem to be certain evolutionary shifts that can map on to what the evolutionary awakening traditions speak about. But they are reserved as a focus for after the radical awakening process is much more stable. Until that is the case, the radical awakening traditions aren't really much interested to talk about that. And it remains, in my view, it remains an open question how much they actually give instructional teachings on how to do those stages and how much they actually suggest that they're just automatic processes that happen as a result of stabilized awakening. It's not fully clear, but the clear thing is that they focus primarily on radical awakening and are for the most part not really interested in the evolutionary side. And then if you go to the evolutionary side, the evolutionary awakening pathways and practices that involve either, and if we're looking now in the esoteric and more mystical domains, whether we're talking about, I feel like the evolutionary awakening traditions can really be traced back to ancient Egypt. For instance, if you look at what the ancient Egyptian spirituality is all about, I've spent a couple of decades in that, going very, very deep into it. It's been another passion of mine. And yeah, it's if you I mean, there's a whole doorway opening up in me as I kind of focus in on that and just tuning into what level of detail to go into. But there are very good cases to be made that the ancient Egyptian spirituality was a meticulous, sophisticated, initiatory pathway for moving people from personality into soul and then also opening to spirit. Now, that then, I think, contributed deeply to Masonic spirituality. That's a whole other really interesting thing to think about, which is the Masons and the Freemasons. Actually, that's a spiritual tradition in itself of soul initiation that absolutely is, in my view, a carry on from ancient Egypt within the evolutionary awakening vector. And then things like Neoplatonism and through to the Abrahamic traditions in their mystical esoteric dimensions, and then things like Theosophy, the Trans-Himalayan teachings, and so on. These pathways, they provide uh, practices and injunctions for moving from personality to soul, waking up to who you are as a soul, actualizing the energies and potentials of your soul to bring them online and how you show up in the world, and then into spirit. Now, it seems that there are certain levels of the evolutionary awakening. Well, I would say it more than it seems. My experience and my understanding is that this is just true. There's certain levels of the evolutionary awakening process where radical awakening starts to come online naturally as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, in the Trans-Himalayan teachings, one of their really valuable models is the model of the five initiations. So this is it's a model that says that as souls are coming to the culminating stages of their journey through being a human being in the human kingdom, they go through a series of five major shifts that the Trans-Himalayan teachings map out. The terminology they use is from the kind of mystical Christian teachings and the life of Jesus through the birth, the baptism, the transfiguration, the crucifixion, and the revelation. In Earth is Eden, something I did was look for evidence for those stages of evolutionary awakening in other traditions as well. And I think there's good arguments to be made that there are examples of those stages in other traditions as well. Now, if we go deeply into what those stages of development represent, first of all, they're primarily evolutionary awakening, or that's a good lens to start with. However, you could say that in the third initiation that they describe, radical awakening definitely starts to come online more naturally, and in the fourth initiation it becomes stable. So yeah, basically what I'm saying here is it seems that on both sides, the radical awakening side and the evolutionary awakening side, the advanced levels of their paths seem to naturally bring online the other side. um, and and then there's all kind of, if you want to, yeah, looking at that in even further details of granularity is some really interesting questions, like what are the barriers or the problems that happen there? What examples are there of spiritual teachers who've demonstrated that kind of thing? Where have we seen that go well? Where have we seen that not go well? So but yeah, that's a place that I would start from.
Mm-hmm. So in the book, you also write that on the evolutionary vector, that I need to bring 2/3 of my energy matter, physical, etheric, astral, mental, into harmony with my soul in order to shift my identification or integration from the body mind to the soul. Can you elaborate on that? And how do I know how close I am to 67%?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, what I'd say is that this is a high detail level teaching. This is one of those parts of the Trans-Himalayan teachings that's very at a very high level of detail and kind of ambiguous in a certain way. There's no way for us to verify this really. It's just something that this teacher says at a certain point, and he also relativizes this teaching. He says that the so to unpack what you're saying, basically what he says is that in order for an initiation to happen, so first of all, let's back up. So to expand on this idea of initiation as representative of fundamental shifts that happen along the evolutionary awakening journey, and then also including radical awakening in their more advanced stages. Basically, the idea here is that most people are familiar with initiation as it's understood and presented within certain human cultures, perhaps indigenous cultures, where initiation rites and rituals still exist. We're not talking about that here. We're talking about initiation as a law of the soul realm, basically. So it's a subtle level understanding. And basically, it's suggesting that a law, this is just how things work, dimension of the process of soul evolution as it extends across lifetimes, is that there are certain fundamental stages on the path where there are significant stable shifts that happen that transition what have previously been peak states through to being the basis for further stages of development. So just if we go through, I can just go through those five that are spoken of in the Trans-Himalayan teachings really quickly to expand also just say it's not that there are just five, but there are seven. It extends beyond that. Even in a certain way, you could say that this path is described as never ending. But those five mark the culminating stages of a soul's journey through the experience of being a human being, and then their transition into this other sphere of being that apparently masters inhabit. So the first is the at the birth, and that basically relates to a the idea is that this is where the soul or the individual, let's describe that the individual has had enough soul intuition percolate down into their awareness to start to sense, I think I'm part maybe of a sacred universe. I think maybe there's some sacred dimension to this whole thing, and that conviction becomes strong enough for them that they enter the path. And by entering the path, what I mean is they then choose to engage, they commit themselves to certain disciplines, whether it's meditation, whether it's yoga, whether it's spiritual study, whether it's ecstatic dance every Thursday, whatever it is, whether it's diet, there's certain disciplines that they commit themselves to that support them to enter the path. It's said that that process goes on for a long time and leads eventually to the second initiation, which said actually there can be several lifetimes that exist between the first initiation and second. But the second is where it's focused on the emotional level, and it's said that this is where there's enough of the love nature of the soul that starts to pour down into the being, that it produces a crisis between the love nature of the soul and the normal patterns that run most people's emotional body. And the normal patterns that run most people's emotional body is I want what I like, and I don't want what I don't like, and I want what I want, and I don't want what I don't want. And what runs most of humanity's emotional body is those kinds of patterns. And in the process of the second initiation, there's a tension and a conflict between that and the love of the soul that's pouring in, which is actually, I'm realizing that I'm here to serve. I'm here for love. I'm feeling waves of compassion move through me for me and all other beings. In a certain way, you could say that the Buddhist idea of the Bodhisattva vow, where a being realizes, okay, no, I'm here for everyone now. And that becomes the foundation of my life and my path. That's really at the core of the second initiation. That then leads to the third, and it's said at the third initiation, that's where you start to have the soul, transpersonal soul who knows who it is as a divine child of God that anchors all the way into the base center, into the base of the spine. It's said to be the first point that you have a conscious soul in the body. They know who they are as a soul, and they it's said in the third initiation that landing of the soul, the essential spiritual entity, all the way down into the base center releases Kundalini. There's a link up between crown and base of the downpouring energy and will of the soul, the uprising Kundalini energy of the body. A third degree initiate is understood to be a being who is mature in their world service. That, in the second initiation, it's said that a being, yeah.
So when you say Kundalini awakening, would that automatically mean if I have a Kundalini awakening that I'm in the third initiation? Because there seem to be many people who have that, right?
Yeah. So there's a difference between a Kundalini awakening as a state and a Kundalini awakening as the way that it's described in the third initiation process. So a lot of people have Kundalini awakenings, which are peak states, and people can equally have peak states of radical awakening. People can have peak states of soul contact. People can have peak states of, there's lots of peak states, that can happen, which represent legitimate leading edges of our development, but they are temporary and are important and significant reference points for our potential, but temporary, right? And people can also have Kundalini awakening experiences where they genuinely access a deeper level of the inherent life force, subtle energy life force that's anchored in their body, and that starts to become a more regular aspect of their experience. But the Kundalini awakening of the third initiation is where it's not just a Kundalini activation and raising, there's also the downpouring energy and consciousness of the soul that pours all the way down into the body and into the brain so that the being knows consciously who they are as a transpersonal journeying entity of light and of love and of purpose, and a stable raising of the serpent energy of their body, so that actually you have a unbroken channel between the soul, the oversoul, you could say, the being that we are, kind of deeper than the personality structure, and the Kundalini energy of the body. And for that to be the case, for that to actually be a real thing, all the stuff in between that normally blocks that has to have some resolution to it. So the emotional blocks, the ways that I struggle to stay true and in alignment to who I am as a soul and as love in my emotional level, or in my erotic level, or in my physical level, there has to be some resolution that happens there.
And I assume this is more than a mental concept, right? I think a lot of spiritual people would say, yeah, of course, I'm a soul. I know that. But the actually feeling that in every moment, that's a different thing, right?
Absolutely. That's a really important point to touch on. No, I'm talking about a living experience that you are undeniably a child of God. And I don't mean that in terms of a mental construct. I don't mean that in terms of a belief.
It's not an Instagram quote.
It's not an Instagram quote. It's a living energetic reality where the nature and sacredness of that realization is an ever present part of one's experience in a way that's breaking one open to the beauty and truth of that. And just touching on this question that you just brought up, it illuminates the challenges of this topic in a certain way, because it is really common for people around this topic to imagine that to place themselves. I mean, we all have a tendency to overestimate or underestimate ourselves, right? Sometimes we underestimate ourselves, sometimes we overestimate ourselves. And I know for me, at the beginning, when I first started to connect to this topic, I was like, oh yeah, maybe I'm there, and I later, as I came to understand it more and I came to journey on the path, there was a lot more humility that came with a recognition of just how significant these stages of development really, what they really represent, and at the same time, I think that the value of what we've received in these teachings is such that there are a collection of actually very clear markers for what we're talking about, for what such a being represents, that do give us helpful orientation. So yeah, and for instance, the point that I made before about a third degree initiate is a mature world server. So it's said that in the second, and an interesting dimension of this is that you can look at the developments of the different initiations through the lens of the four quadrants from integral theory, for instance. So that's an interesting angle on it. So you could say, like, in the second initiation, in the interior experience of the individual, you have the love of the soul starts to anchor in and produce a conflict between that and the regular, more self-oriented emotional drives that govern us. In the exterior of the individual, you could say, like, there's an activation of the heart chakra and a tension between the heart chakra and the solar plexus, which normally is the kind of brain of the emotional body, you could say. In the dimension of our kind of collective group life, as it were, you could say that the second initiation has us find our group, find our beings who we're on a path with, and we start to sense, okay, here's the people I'm journeying with, here's my tribe. And it also, you could say, the second initiation is where there's an activation, the being starts to connect to their soul purpose, right? But in the third initiation, that soul purpose is a stable expression of a mature world server in action. Now that's a big deal. Like, that means that the being not only is clear about what they're up to, it means they have a clear channel for expressing it, and they simultaneously have they're able to integrate that with teamwork, money, making a living, these types of things. It said that a third degree, if I just finish that point, a third degree initiate is a being whose radiation is such that they naturally become a point around which other beings gather, whether it's in a business or a spiritual community or in teams where other beings are going through healing, awakening, and evolutionary processes by being in that person's field. Because they they start to become radioactive essentially, and that's also the monadic piece. The monadic piece starts to activate naturally in the being in the third degree, in the third initiation, and makes that being they naturally start to have a field around them of beings who are growing in their yeah, in their field.
Mm-hmm. Do you have examples of living beings today that are in this third
Yeah, for
initiation?
sure. I think Martin Luther King is probably a third degree initiate. Um, yeah, I think the Dalai Lama to me is probably a third degree initiate. That's not to say that they have to be operating at that level of scale. There's a woman who I can immediately think of in Berlin she is a facilitator and a leader who runs groups and does session work, and my sense is that she's a third degree initiate. She's and why do I feel that? Well, I mean, I feel like there's a couple more actually in Berlin that I would describe, that I have awareness of and more in the wider field as well. And why would I say that? Well, I know that that being knows who they are as a soul in their body. I know that they are that is stably anchored in them. They're completely clear about what they're up to in the world in terms of their purpose and the service that they're bringing. They are not destabilized by their own emotional processes, but nor are they denying or repressing them. They can feel deeply, but from a place where their presence is stable, and they engage their mental, emotional, erotic, and physical life in alignment with who they are as a soul. That's integrated with how they do money. Um, yeah, it's they are a stable, anchored expression of embodied soul in the world. Those are the key marks of the third degree. Yeah, the third initiation. Um,
Are there any specific practices to go from second to third initiation?
it's not really a thing where it's about specific practices. I think it's because it's perhaps that's a thing which it could take a few lifetimes, in a certain way. Although in the Trans-Himalayan teachings, and this, we get into bigger scales of consideration here, it's said that we're at a time where there are such powerful energies pouring into the planet as far as the awakening and evolutionary and initiatory process of humanity at large and the planet as a whole, that it's said that in a way that's unprecedented, certain beings can undergo the second, third, and even fourth initiations in one lifetime at the current time. So it's just understood that there are energies which are so powerful that they're massively accelerating the evolutionary process for all of us actually in certain ways, and also for certain beings who can navigate what I just mentioned. So, but yeah, to certainly purpose work in terms of the clarification, the learning, the demonstration, like being in the journey of how to live as who you are as a soul in the expression of the purpose which is yours to be in service to is really important. Being in they're kind of life lessons in a certain way, the learning how you can integrate that with how you do your relationships and your erotic life and your financial life, where you're based on the earth. Yeah, I'm not sure there are practices for that where it's more a growing and learning as you go kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing. Yeah.
So after the third initiation, there's the
Yeah,
fourth.
so the fourth is described as the crucifixion, and it's said that Jesus was demonstrating the crucifixion. It's said that actually the life of Jesus mystically was a demonstration of these five initiatory stages for those who had eyes to see. And then a really interesting thing about that is that those five stages of initiation are understood to have been at the core of the initiatory processes of the ancient mystery schools. So, for instance, we know that there was an ancient Egyptian mystery school that had various temples that served different aspects and facets of the evolutionary process. We also know that the ancient Greeks had mystery schools. There are significant leaders and influencers of the ancient world who openly acknowledged that they had been through the initiatory processes of the ancient mystery schools. Plato acknowledged it. Pythagoras acknowledged it. Herodotus acknowledged it. This is not woo-woo stuff. We know these existed. In Rome, it's also, there were ancient mystery schools. Now, I have spent a long time really deeply researching and going into, okay, well, what were these initiatory processes that beings were taken through? And I think there's a really good case to be made that they map on very well to these five initiations I'm describing, and that the significance of one aspect of the significance of the life of Jesus was that he deliberately took the demonstration of these five initiations. Essentially, he took them public, and that prior to this they had been reserved for the secrecy of the interior of the mystery school processes. And essentially the mystery schools were for the elite. They were for the developmental, if not the cultural and financial and social elite of the ancient world. And the life of Jesus, in my view, was about, okay, let's open this up, and yeah, in certain ways that didn't go very well, right? Because of also the politicization of the life of Jesus subsequent to his death, and the leveraging of certain perspectives around it for greater political and social power. So that's obviously a whole other story. So, but with regard to the fourth initiation, yeah, it's the crucifixion, and it's understood that this is the point where um, the being becomes a liberated soul. So um, they're who they are as a soul is liberated from the cycle of incarnations. They can continue to incarnate should they choose, but no longer under karmic necessity. Yeah, so it's the point where radical awakening becomes stable. It's also understood that in the fourth initiation, that is where the soul has established itself as a stable bridge between spirit and matter. So this starts to open us up a bit more deeply into the conversation around the monad, or the spirit aspect that the Trans-Himalayan teachings describe within as part of the different levels and layers of who we are. So um and there's more to be said about that, but it's understood that the fourth initiation involves a stable channel established between who we are as spirit all the way into our embodied self, and that actually burns through, it said, that current of fire is said that it burns through the last illusions of individuality in the soul, which also contributes to stable radical awakening, opening up. And in the fifth initiation, it's said that that's where you have the all layers, physical, emotional, mental, soulful, into spirit, of the being have essentially been rewired into conformity with the one, and you have a master. So a fifth degree initiate is described as a master, and they also it's said that they start to inhabit revelation of the wider spheres of purpose that the earth is an expression of, and like there's kind of cosmic downloads of what the earth is here for that start to become part of their experience, and they start to access what's described as Shambhala. So Shambhala is understood to be the community of beings who operate as monads or as expressions of spirit within the overall field of the earth. So, that points to the understanding that there are levels of evolutionary development, even beyond soul, that, and extending actually far beyond that, that remain for us as speculations. And at the same time, beings who claim and have a reasonable case for being seriously considered to be operating at those levels are very clear. There are stages of development as it in advance of them as they are in advance of us.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and just maybe the last point I'd make is talking about the monadic piece, which is a really interesting thing to consider around the conversations with radical awakening and evolutionary awakening. There are examples of Eastern teachers who have some degree of radical awakening. I mean, there's examples of Western teachers as well, but there are teachers who have some stability of radical awakening who are just clearly demonstrating something different. Who are demonstrating there's a level of power which is pouring through their presence that is beyond, then there's a lot of radical awakening teachers who have some stability of radical awakening and they're really loving beings. Like the Tibetan tradition has a good example of those, like a good number that there's definitely some stability of radical awakening and they're really loving beings. But then there are other beings who they're not just really loving beings, but there's a transmission of power that is moving through them that is transmitting from their body and producing strong impact and effect in the people in their field. So
Do you have examples?
yeah, there's a little case study, right? So I always find one of the most fascinating case studies to look at this question is Adi Da, right? So I don't know if you're familiar with Adi Da, but Adi Da was a American, born Franklin Jones. I think he was born in 1939. He died, I think, in 2008. Now, Adi Da was, in my view and the view of a lot of other people, clearly one of the most powerfully awakened human beings since Buddha or Christ. It's extraordinary, the depth and power of his awakening. He also, and I want to say this in the most respectful way, because it could also be that there's members of Adi Da's community that watch this. So I'm just naming my own personal perspective here. I take full responsibility for my own personal perspective. I perceive that there were really clear distortions, really significant and really problematic distortions in the way that Adi Da navigated power, and in the way certain very disempowering ways I perceive that he taught his students, and in certain stories of huge grandiosity he started to enter into around himself and his place within the evolutionary process. Now, my perspective is that Adi Da is a good example of a being who not only was radically awakened, because he obviously was stably radically awakened, but he also had awakened to who he is as a soul. He seemed to have, a decent sense of his soul trajectory and certain mysteries of his soul path and so on. I think he also clearly had an opening to his own monadic level too, and that contributed to the power. The monad is really the source of the power in a being, divine power. And I think he's a good example of someone where there were certain pathologies that are really important to consider and to look at as well. I think there may have been certain shadows of his personality that never got the attention that they needed to, around the way that he did power and also his ego structure. Other really interesting considerations are that perhaps the monadic energy that was pouring through him actually produced an inflation of his ego rather than a humbling of his ego. And I think there are examples of spiritual teachers where that tends to happen. There's an inflation of the personal self where they start to, when that is added to radical awakening, it starts to manifest as, I am the one. rather than, there's been an awakening to the one here, it's I am the one, and then there's a request for the devotees to transfer their power to that being because they are the one and they should have the power, and it all becomes very unhealthy. So yeah, there's various other things I could say, but Adida is a good example of a being who, in my view, was probably a fourth degree initiate. There's just a different level of power moving through him. There's certain other teachers I've had a sense of in the world who are also, could be that the Dalai Lama is a fourth degree initiate. I remember I was in his presence once, and I did not, I wasn't prepared for the power of his presence, for the energetic impact of being around him, and it wasn't something I imagined, but it was palpable and very, very strong. But yeah, so this is, speaking to some of the pieces. Actually, I didn't even answer the question that you asked. So that was all. That was all just that was all a frame to get to what you asked about the 2/3 piece.
Yeah. Well, I think you answered that. There's like not a clear guidebook. Here are the 10 steps to go from.
Well, let me just touch on the let me just touch on the 2/3 piece, because it's actually an important piece. So within the whole frame of what I've just described, then a teaching that's given in the Trans-Himalayan stuff is that in order for an initiation to happen, it does not require mastery of 100% of a particular level to move to the next level. It requires mastery of 2/3 of a level to move to the next level. So, and that's relativized as saying that that's the truth within the current evolutionary cycle. Maybe that will be different in the future and there'll be more that needs to be mastered. Maybe it was different in the past, but it's said to be the truth of the current evolutionary cycle. Now, that's important because it means that if we're talking about a being taking the second initiation, it means that 2/3 of the time they can be navigating their emotional processes, remembering who they are as a soul and persisting as love. 1/3 of the time they can be a jerk. 1/3 of the time actually they're lost in their stuff, lost in their shadow, and that is something to consider as the path goes on. It's understood that to take the third initiation, to take the fourth, maybe that's a way that we understand the situation of Adida, that yes, 2/3 was of an extraordinary level of development. 1/3 had some really problematic shadows that remained and that had not been worked out. Now, it's understood that we have choice here. So when we are navigating our own path, we can make important choices to choose how much we continue to stay with a particular level of our development and really focus on doing more of my shadow work here, doing more of my healing work at really inquiring deeply into and asking myself the difficult questions around what are the pieces that I don't want to look at, that I'm not willing to look at, that could be playing out from under the surface. Or I can choose to just keep persisting on, and pioneering into that next peak level of my unfolding. And yeah, it's I don't think there's a wrong answer and there's not a right answer, but sometimes it's the right thing to pioneer on into that deeper level of development and not ask of us that we're perfect. And sometimes the right thing is wait. Actually, I realize that the further I go in my development, the greater the potential karmic consequences of distortions are. Let me make sure I really look at everything I need to look at so that those distortions don't become part of how I operate. And that potentially, even if I don't do that, it could become even more unbalanced with the higher power energies that are starting to pour into me. So it's just some interesting questions there.
Yeah, so when you look at Ken Wilber grow up, wake up, clean up, show up, do you see this is like this certain order you should follow?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I see it as an order, but I do see it that those are really good pieces to consider constantly. And, one perspective that Wilbur has shared as in his reflections around Adida, because Adida is just a person of interest as far as people exploring a kind of a spiritual psychology that can integrate all the pieces that we're talking about here. Something that Wilbur said is that he feels like maybe a factor that contributed to the distortions in Da was that he just didn't have a group of peers around him who could really ask him the difficult questions around what was going on, and And of course, actually, that's easy to say. I feel like I've witnessed certain other beings in my journey certain other teachers who I sense are in the fourth degree. And sometimes when there's been shadowy stuff in my perception that's been going on, they have resisted feedback and they have resisted reflection. And from their perspective, and I have sympathy from that perspective, for their perspective, it's like, well, I'm not sure you can really see. Sometimes it's difficult to receive feedback from people where we feel like they don't really see what we're trying to navigate or what we're holding, and there's a truth to that. It's there's a tension in giving feedback to someone where we can't see where they're actually operating from. However, we start to we start to get ourselves into very tricky areas if leaders of any kind, whether it's spiritual or otherwise, immunize themselves from feedback and reflection.
Mm-hmm. I would love if you would explain the 7 rays ashrams and how they relate to
Yeah,
our
sure.
souls.
Yeah. So this is a part of the Trans-Himalayan teaching, which suggests that it's the typological aspect of the teaching. So there's different typological models and teachings, whether it ranges from the 5 wisdom families, Buddha families in the Buddhist tradition, through to the I don't know the various personality psychometric kind of or typological tests that exist within Western psychology and so on, Myers-Briggs and so on, or the Enneagram is another one. The 7 rays is the understanding that as reality manifests, on a subtle level, it does so through 7 primordial energy streams that weave together to influence and produce different qualities in all creation. And human beings are one place where they weave together to produce different types of expression in who we are. So it's a complex system that has various levels of detail and depth, but the simple layer is the understanding that in the different layers of our being that we've touched on from an evolutionary perspective, so personality, soul, spirit / monad, that they can be on different rays. So our personality structure can be, it's said, on any one of the 7 rays. Our soul can be on any one of the 7 rays, and it's said our spirit or our monad can be on any one of the first 3. So the 7 rays enumerated are: the first ray is the ray of will and power. And imagine beings like Alexander the Great or Akbar or various pioneering breakthrough leaders who don't wait for permission before they kind of break through or penetrate into new territory. The second ray is the ray of love and wisdom, and that's really the ray of Buddha and Christ. They're said to be good examples of the wisdom side and the love side, respectively. It's the ray of spiritual teaching and spiritual education, healing. The third ray is the ray of creative intelligence, and that is the ray of, you could say, people who are creatives. And Bucky Fuller is a good example of perhaps someone on the third ray, someone, innovators, creators who they're constantly birthing new creative ideas for the innovation, evolution, and updating of our world. Fourth ray, harmony through conflict, and that is the ray, you could say, of artists. The ray of creative. Yeah, it's the ray of the struggling artist is a good example there. The melancholic struggling artist, the one who is moved by deep conflict but has a drive towards bringing those conflicting forces within them into harmony to create something beautiful. The fifth ray is the ray of concrete science, and that is like the ray of scientists, engineers, Albert Einstein, Stephen Hawking. Sixth ray, devotion and idealism. So this is the ray of devotees and prophets, you could say, in a certain way, and on a human level, people who really want you to believe their thing, and The seventh ray, the ray of ceremony, ritual, sacred embodiment. Yeah. Um, so it's understood that our personality structures can be on any of those rays, our souls can be on any of those rays. And to speak to your question on soul levels, it's understood that there are seven soul ashrams. So it's understood that we as souls, when we start to wake up and choose to take our place as contributors to the evolutionary process happening on the planet, we find ourselves according to our soul ray in one of the ashrams. So if we're a first ray soul, then we start to operate as a unit within the first ray ashram. If we're a fourth ray soul, we start to operate as a unit within the fourth ray ashram. So again, these ashrams, I'm talking about a soul, a field of souls that are all vibrating to the same energy and essentially are all they're all expressing their unique version of that particular stream of the evolutionary process of updating that aspect of our collective journey. So first ray souls are active often as leaders or, pioneers, sometimes in politics and government as well, and all the way through according to the domains that I listed. But yeah, and there's more detail and granularity in the model. Astrology is a part of it, and the astrological energies that we're connected to add more complexity. And there's also understanding we have mental rays, emotional rays, physical rays. So yeah, but that kind of speaks to the idea that of the seven soul ashrams. And if you remember that with this, we're really talking about some feature of the evolutionary awakening side. The relevance of that is how we show up in the world. It's how we, because it's understood that when a being is starting to wake up to who they are as a soul and express their unique note of purpose, which is actually their unique expression of a shared purpose that exists through these ashrams, it's about participating and contributing to the evolutionary process that's happening on the planet. And so, and that, yeah, the Trans-Himalayan teachings then also have a vast presentation of what that is. What is the significance of the evolutionary process happening on the planet.
And to clearly identify in which ray your soul is, you would need to already be initiated to the soul and have like a clearer sense of your soul? Or can you just look at your life and be like, oh yeah, I'm a politician, so I'm in that ray?
Yeah, you'd need to have enough contact with your own soul energy to be able to feel it, basically. And the idea is that the ray can be felt in the quality of the energy. So um, a person needs to be a integrated enough personality to be just operating in their personality life and inclinations for one to get a sense of, I think this is probably a third rate personality that we're looking at, or this is probably a seventh rate personality that we're looking at. Again, greater complexity would ask us to also understand, okay, well, what are the astrological energies going on for this person, certain other considerations as well. But yeah, for us to get a sense of the soul ray, the person would have to have enough soul energy alive in their path in their life that, yeah, one could tune into that energy and what its nature and its quality is experientially and also by observation of the life. And yeah, that's an important question because the reality is that an outer expression of these initiatory processes happening that we can perhaps observe in our own life or the life of others is crisis. That often there's crisis that becomes the catalytic energy that produces a transition to open us to these deeper levels of who we are. So most people come to their soul through crisis. I have a friend who says suffering is all of our first teacher. And so people tend to have yeah, contact with who they are as a soul and their soul energy open up through some kind of crisis in their personality life, often an existential crisis where the regular things that seem satisfying or interesting to someone living a personality life no longer feel satisfying or interesting. You know, the idea of me getting that job and getting the Porsche and, you know, whatever, it's just like, it just doesn't do it for me anymore, you know, and there's, I'm attracted to something else that is more ephemeral and ethereal and, but much more compelling to me. And yeah, that's an example of the kind of crisis of meaning that forces the emergence of some deeper layer. And then once that layer is online or it's starting to move through us, then we can start to sense what its ray energy is. But it would be difficult to try and tune into the soul ray energy of someone who is basically, you know, mostly living a personality based life.
Yeah,
Yeah.
makes sense.
Some people have tried, like some Trans-Himalayan students have tried to develop like psychometric tests and stuff that can be like, hey, take this test and it'll show you what your soul ray is and so on. And I think it's a bit, I don't know. I'm not fully confident that that's a thing.
Mhm. So, a lot of people listening to this podcast are spiritual seekers, so they maybe don't feel that they are yet evolved much on the radical awakening vector. What would be an important piece of advice for spiritual seekers that maybe you see in a lot of spiritual people that is missing for their awakening?
First of all, I feel like I always trust a person listening to what feels most alive and what feels most true for them. So we all have an inner compass that points in the direction that is the right direction for us to go at some particular phase of our path. And I think rather than someone beginning with some imposed mental structure of what I should be doing and then trying to do that, I first of all would invite someone to just tune in and sense what are you feeling really inspired by? Like what feels alive and true for you? And, you know, whether that's being drawn towards deeper psychological healing work or whether it's to do with going and connecting with some shamanic spirituality or whether it's to soul work or radical awakening or whatever it might be, that would be my first question. Second, then it would be to say, okay, well, and it's probably a good idea for all of us to have some sense of the wake up, grow up, clean up, show up dimensions of the path. You know, the wake up piece for me, you know, that maps onto the radical awakening piece and also just to trust there that that tends to really come online as something that feels really important to people at a certain stage of the journey. And if that doesn't feel super important, that's, you know, that's okay. But if it does at some point, um, yeah, explore who are teachers that feel like teachers and pathways that feel like you can really resonate with, feel yourself understood in, feel yourself welcome in, feel like there's an opportunity to feel supported in taking that path. Growing up, I feel really kind of maps on to the evolutionary awakening piece. Can include the psychological kind of growth, and in integral terms, it's really about updating and, you know, developing more inclusive worldviews. But to me, that also maps onto, hey, who are you as a soul? You know, like who are you as a soul, and how can each of us, yeah, become more comfortably mature in being souls in this world, here to offer something and contribute something and find our place within the wider evolutionary process. And there are pathways of ascending soul work, pathways of descending soul work. Look into that whole domain. Cleaning up the psychological healing and shadow work piece. I think everybody in the world needs therapy. You know, we all need body work. We all need therapy. You know, we all need help healing ourselves of the traumas that are pervasive to human culture because of the thousands of years of really painful ways that we've been living. You know, and show up, like tune in, like what is the contribution that would bring you alive to make to your field, whether that's your family, whether that's your community, um, your friends. How does the magic of what lives in you want to come out and express itself as a gift to others in a way that brings you more deeply alive as well? So tuning into those factors would be my advice. Yeah.
You have a course coming up, AVATARA.
Yeah. I run this international spiritual community called AVATARA, which in a sense is really dedicated to all the stuff that we've been speaking about, providing spiritual training and education that integrates radical awakening and evolutionary awakening across all the stuff that we've been describing. I'm going to be running an online course called Reality, the Great Tradition of Radical Awakening, that is about highlighting and illuminating and bringing together core insights from the different radical awakening pathways, from Dzogchen to Theravada to Buddhist Tantra to Shaivite Tantra to Mahamudra, like core insights from the different radical awakening teachings, and Vedanta as well, to really illuminate these incredible traditions of what it means to awaken to and as the ultimate ground of being, and see what is the even more integrative or holistic view of the path of radical awakening that we get when we start to bring them together. So that's one piece. And then also I'm running 3 AVATARA retreats this year, one in the USA on the East Coast, one in Finland, and one in Berlin. The mystery of what it truly means to be human, that I also invite people to check out. That's about, how do we do this work that I've been speaking about? How do we experience it? What practices that we do with ourselves and community with others in connection with land as well? So I highly advise people to check out AVATARA. They can check out the AVATARA Facebook group, the website as well, avatara.one. Yeah.
We will link everything in the description so you can check it out on Spotify and YouTube in this podcast description. Thank you, Jon, for sharing that. And there will be a part 2. So if you're seeing this right now on YouTube, you can just click here, check out part 2 on the great human tradition and the planetary purpose of the Earth. Sending you much love.